into distressed communities, and so we went to Liberty City.
Yep, absolutely.
And then we went to a Hispanic, it's like almost like a little Hispanic work area where there's workforce housing.
Homestead?
Somewhere.
Was it agriculture?
Agriculture, yeah.
Yeah, it was probably Florida City or like Homestead down a little south.
Yes. It
kind
was
of before the Keys is where big agriculture.
Okay, and folks lived there, and it's really different.
It is different. I have never seen the living quarters.
Yeah,
but
they're small.
They are.
Yep. And interestingly enough, probably a third or more were U.S. citizens whose parents worked there, and so they grew up there, and they just stuck around.
I believe it.
Yeah, which is interesting. So.
My family is in the agriculture business.
Okay.
So I grew up going to the farms, and there's tons of people.
Yes, it's amazing. Different world.
Different world. I actually, oh, sorry, we're going to start in 1 second. But I did a story once on the labor force, and I spoke to some random labor guy who has an office on Meeting Street. Oh. And whatever, did the story, no problem. 6 months later, he sent me a selfie. He was in Miami with my aunt, who was trying to find ways to recruit people for the farms because they fall into shortages. Yep. But I was like, what are the chances that some little guy with his office on Meeting, I mean, it was like a 2-little-room office. It was crazy. Okay, so we are going to start. They will be switching between cameras. Okay. You don't have to worry about that.
Yep, so just look at you.
Yep. Okay. So first question is always the easiest, just so we can check your mic. Can I have you say your name and title?
Okay. Tim Scott, U.S. Senator.
Easy.
I was going to spell my name.
So Senator Scott, I know, I figured it was too easy. Yeah. Senator Scott, we are here talking about your Veterans event, which is coming up. Tell me about it.
I'm so excited. We are doing a Women in Uniform. So we're going to honor the women who have donned the uniform to keep us all safe, living in peace. On the Saturday before Veterans Day, November the 10th, 10 a.m., Columbia, South Carolina, more than 43,000 South Carolinians have served in uniform who are women. So we want to take the time, step back, and say thank you. Let's show them some real appreciation. Show up. It's a free event. You only have to RSVP at scott.senate.gov/veteransRSVP.
And what's going to make up the event? Is it a day at a park? Is it what's it going to be made up?
It's a celebration event. So we're going to have a combat veteran as our keynote speaker, who happens to be a U.S. Senator, Joni Ernst, who was on the president's short list to be vice president. She is from Iowa. She will be here in state. She was in the Fort Jackson area several years ago. So she's familiar with our state. I'm looking forward to having her back and allowing her listening to her combat stories as we celebrate women who've served this nation. It's going to be a great event. You'll all want to be there. Please RSVP. And
as you were deciding which direction you wanted to go when you were planning a veterans event, why did you choose to honor women in the armed forces?
That's a great question. So over the last few years, I've done a number of women in leadership events, all focused on business, professional women, maybe some educators. This time around, I decided that the best way for me to honor women in leadership is to focus on the military. In the past, I've done a World War II event, I've done a Korean conflict event, a Vietnam conflict event, Desert Storm, Desert Shield. This year, I've decided to bring those two paths together and do women in leadership, but women in leadership in the military. Wonderful. So we'll have a good time.
I was just working on a veteran story upstairs, and I was hearing from Boeing and how important it is for them to include veterans in their workforce, especially that we're in the South and there is a big veteran population. What's the significance of the people you serve and just how important veterans are here in South Carolina?
Tremendously important here at home. We are one of the best and most friendly veteran states in the nation. Boeing and many other companies, we had a joint event where we had a jobs event. Over 2,000 folks showed up and went through 100+ vendors, companies looking to hire veterans. It worked out really well. So South Carolina is home to a ton of veterans. We're home to veterans because they know we love them. And with Joint Base Charleston to Spay-War and to so many other of our assets, folks like to come to the area, make it their home because we put a premium on being a state that loves our veterans.
And I imagine that you would say that people who show up to your event are supporting veterans, right?
Absolutely. If you're going to come out, you're coming out for one reason, because you love our military and you're looking for a way to say thank you to so many folks who do what you don't have to do if you're a civilian. And for those who show up who are veterans, we will have an actual celebration for the women who served in uniform.
Wonderful. Anything else that I didn't ask you about the event?
Nope. I think the most important issue is that we've got a great speaker. We've got hundreds already signed up. We want a jam-packed room, so come on out and join us.
And remind me, it is free?
It is free.
You just have to RSVP.
We want you to RSVP. You can get in if you don't, but we want everyone to RSVP so we can be prepared for the crowds. We've done 4 of these events before, and so this is a chance for us to continue the momentum of South Carolina being the state that truly appreciates veterans the most.
And are there particular times where people can show up?
Sounds great. So the event starts at 10 a.m. It'll go to noon, but you can come a couple of hours early or stay a couple of hours late. We'll have a lot of programs that are designed to help folks understand and appreciate military service. We typically have the Boy Scouts and a number of other folks involved and organizations involved in the process as well.
Wonderful. Anything else?
No, ma'am.
Okay, let's talk some news of day stuff.
There's news of the day.
Always is.
Well,
we'll find it.
Today's Tuesday.
Yesterday, a pretty non-important day. Yesterday, President Trump introduced the idea of ending birthright citizenship. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've heard about that. The fact of the matter is that the ability to end birthright citizenship goes back to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment that talks about under the jurisdiction thereof. The question really is, what does that mean? We're going to have a robust conversation about that. Typically, that's going to require our courts to get involved, probably the Supreme Court. To do it through an executive order is a stretch from my perspective, but it certainly starts the conversation. I'm not quite sure what that, what the current interpretation of under the jurisdiction thereof means, and we'll have a chance to have great clarity on that.
And do you think that move is the right move for the United States?
Well, this depends. Bottom line is this: we have a lot of folks who plan, their objective in life is to become an American citizen. I think there's about 6.9 billion people on earth who all want to live in America. The question is, can we do it in a legal fashion? Well, we can't do 6.9 billion, period. But can you come to this country in a legal fashion? The answer is yes. We are the most compassionate country. About 35 million Americans were foreign-born who are here legally. So we've been doing it right for a long time. The question of the birthright citizenship is an intriguing question. When you look at the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, its application was mostly to slavery and not to the immigration challenges that we have today. So applying the 14th Amendment to the immigration challenge that we have today, it's going to take a well thought out approach and process, and we're going to engage in that in a very robust and serious way. And
Senator Lindsey Graham has been very vocal about his support for such action. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Lindsey's Lindsey. He does a good job of being clear on this issue, and as well as the Kavanaugh issue. I think this is an issue that's going to have to be studied. Frankly, it's going to be hard for us to do something legislatively as opposed to going through the constitutional route. The question is, will the courts take on the task of clarifying or giving us an interpretation based on the original text on what that jurisdiction really means? Part of the question has been whether or not you're in this country illegally. Do you have the right to are you actually under the jurisdiction thereof? I've understood and have read many articles about folks from foreign countries who will come here in their last trimester of their pregnancy to have a child here on our soil, so that those children are automatically American citizens even though they go back to their home country. So there are a lot of issues that we're going to have to dive into to understand and appreciate why we're having this conversation. But there's no question the conversation is brought to the forefront because of the number of folks who want to call America their home.
And it's happening just a week before the midterm election. Any significance there in terms of timing?
Well, you can always read politics into anything at any time from anywhere. So there's always a hint of politics in a number of issues. I'm not sure. This issue has been percolating, so to speak, for a long time. I'm not surprised that it's coming to the forefront as folks try to bring more issues to persuade voters one way or the other.
Great. Next big story, tragedy in Pittsburgh, a shooting in a synagogue, 11 people dead. Brings up the question of gun violence, gun legislation. You here in South Carolina, this hits extra hard at home because of what we experienced in 2015. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thought should be Matthew 5:44, loving those who persecute you and praying for those who want to see you eliminated. So I think it's really important for us to take a step back first and recognize the human tragedy that occurred in Pittsburgh and not rush to a gun conversation. Factually, South Carolina separated herself from every other place of chaos when something like that ensued, because the families, all 9 families, were represented by someone who said, "We forgive you," to Dylan Roof only 36 hours after the massacre. What I love about Pittsburgh and the Jewish community there is that the first sign I saw was that there's no room for hate. The truth is that the American ethos has always been making room for people who don't agree with you, people who don't look like you, people who don't talk like you, people who are philosophically different from you. What we have to do first is to protect ourselves from finding ourselves in tribal-like areas where we are all sectioning ourselves off like tribes. That is dangerous for who we are. We are more of a patchwork quilt woven together by the threads of democracy and love and respect for one another. If we stay there, then we'll have the chance to have a serious conversation about guns and other issues going forward.
I certainly agree that we are lacking patchwork and are moving maybe in a little separated direction. Do you think that recent rhetoric, maybe hate speech or the way words are being used, have contributed to that division?
Sure, there's no doubt about that. I've started working on legislation. What we've seen on our college campuses around the nation has been a shift towards being anti-Semitic. I started working on legislation about almost 3 years ago on legislation to define what anti-Semitism is on college campuses from a language perspective. The definition has already been codified by the State Department. So we want to make sure that the protections of that were a part of the conversation legislatively, and at the same time sharing the thoughts of the First Amendment, which allows you to have freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So you can have an equilibrium that balances both. So the hate language and hate speech, many of us recognized it 3 or 4 years ago. We need to make more progress on how to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. In the National Forum, we've got a long ways to go for that.
And not necessarily hate speech, because that's more extreme, but our president often says the enemy of the people, or some sayings he likes to repeat. Do you think that that contributes to creating enemies within our smaller communities?
Well, I think everyone has to take responsibility for how they respond to what they hear, and everyone should take responsibility for what they say. We could talk about President Trump, or we could talk about Maxine Waters, we could talk about senators during the Kavanaugh hearing, or we could talk about Democrats in the House and the language that they've used about the other side. So we all should be very careful how we use the mantle of leadership and not to use it in a way that is toxic.
Wonderful. Actually, one more thing. We talk about not the time for gun violence, right? Because we are mourning, and it is important to be sensitive for the people who just underwent this tragedy. Are we finding, and I respect that, are we finding that it's hard because just days before it was Kentucky, so we couldn't talk about it then? Who knows when the next act of gun violence, and I want to be clear that it's gun violence and mental health issues that are at hand. When do we talk about it if it's tragedy after tragedy?
Well, I think the first thing you do is take a look at what's caused the tragedy. Mental illness has more to do with the tragedy than the weapon of choice. So the reality of it is, if we're going to have a conversation about the mass violence in this country, we should start with mental illness. If we're going to have a conversation about gun violence, then we'll probably start with the handgun, because if you go to a place like Chicago, what you'll find is that over 700 lives were lost, mostly by a handgun. Now, I'm not sure if you or the station would suggest that we're going to have a ban on the Second Amendment or to eliminate the Second Amendment. I'm not sure that anybody would actually want to do that. So most of the gun violence in this country, handguns. So if you're looking at the statistics that matter a lot, 30,000 Americans lost their lives because of guns in 2017. 65% of those folks took their own lives with the guns, which means that the issue wasn't the gun. The issue was mental stability. So if we're going to address the issue at hand, we start having a conversation about mental illness.
Do you think it's time to start having that conversation?
Well, we have already started that conversation. I've been a part of the conversation for the last few years. We continue to have the conversation. We've also done some things to make sure that our background check system works as effectively as possible and that it is seamless. That was part of the problem in Charleston. Was the background check that failed that should have prevented the tragedy, at least having the gun. So the mental illness conversation continues. Funding it has been a major priority as well. We saw that perhaps dovetail into the conversation around opioids and mental health. So that conversation was funded by about $3.5, I think it was, $billion in our last spending bill. So we continue to see focus on drug addiction, mental health, as well as poverty, three issues that seem to capture our attention from a strong, solid foundation that allows most Americans to have a significant contribution to their own future.
Great. Last thing, and
Sure.
a much lighter note, Arrington and Cunningham. A
Yes.
big election coming up. Any predictions, any thoughts, any sense there?
Yeah, so I think we're going to have a very competitive day on Tuesday. I think the voters will be heard. I have obviously can't come out with a TV commercial in support of Katie Arrington, so I'm confident that she will be successful. I think she's done a fantastic job. I have served as the 1st Congressional District's Congress member, won that district in 2010 and 2012, so I have an affinity for the 1st Congressional District, born and raised here, so I'm hopeful that we'll continue to have strong, positive leadership, and I'm looking forward to the first female member of the federal delegation in the history of the state.
Awesome. Anything else that you want to talk about?
Hi, Mom.
Already took too much time.
That's about
Thanks.
it. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Where were you born, Senator Scott?
North Charleston.
Oh, really?
Right around the corner.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, right here.
Where in
Born-
North Charleston?
The Naval Hospital.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that it's not doing so great right now.
Yeah, well,
I wish it was more in
I was on
greater
board with that one.
splendor.
Yeah, the challenge.